Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP for short. We are here to celebrate the 2 year anniversary of the American Rescue Plan. Some housekeeping as we get started. We will be streaming this program on Facebook and YouTube, and it will be available on demand after we wrap up. Secondly, we had received some questions during the registration process, but there is also a Q&A function for today's discussion. If you're in need of English captions, you are able to show captions by clicking on More on the bottom right of your screen, then selecting the top option. We are excited to be here with you all today, and we're going to be hearing from many incredible partners in this work. Laura McDaniel from the Treasury, my colleagues Sarah Beth Gale and Maria Filippelli, also Sherelle Bird and Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown and Nellie Katzkin, and then rounding out with Allison Plyer and Alicia Rashid from the data center. We are also going to be showing some slides. So I ask now that Dee Dee, if you could, our communications manager, will share the slides now. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. At the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP for short, we cover 12 Southern states and the policy areas of economic security, climate, and health. We are a resource and a partner with groups on the ground, providing research, capacity building, network building, and civic voice. Over the last 2 years, our main push has been an equitable recovery from COVID-19. So we've been working on federal funds coming to communities and how those funds can be put to use for an equitable recovery. Next slide, please. Today, our discussion will focus on the American Rescue Plan state and local fiscal recovery funds. ARP was a large relief package with funds flowing to individuals, businesses, and nonprofits. But the funds of interest for our discussion are the funds that flow directly to states, cities, counties, and tribal governments. Next slide, please. Very quickly on the basics of the state and local fiscal recovery funds. $350 billion with every government receiving a pool of funds, whether you're a city of 600 people or the state of California, each government received funds. Governments have until the end of 2024 to obligate the funds and the end of 2026 to spend the funds. So this was a longer time horizon than we often see with recovery funds. The uses are a lot more flexible than prior recovery funds. Governments can use the funds for lost public sector revenue, premium pay, water and sewer projects, but the one we at SEAP typically focus on is the second one, responding to the public health and negative economic impacts of the pandemic. Finally, equity and engagement were key features for the first time, and so wanting to know how these funds help disproportionately impacted communities and how local governments were reaching out to residents to hear about their needs and hear about their priority for the funds. As we celebrate the second anniversary of the signing of ARP this week, we are holding this webinar to give an update on the money that's remaining, provide examples of projects that are underway across communities, and hear from some incredible organizers in the South who have been working with communities to have a voice in how these funds are spent. First, we are excited to have Laura McDaniel from the Treasury. Laura McDaniel is the policy advisor overseeing state and local fiscal recovery funds in the Office of Recovery Program at the Treasury. Laura engages and problem solves with recipients, stakeholders, advocates, and federal partners to ensure successful implementation of the SLF-RF program. Laura, we invite you on stage to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you to Sarah Beth Gale and the rest of the SEAP team for having me here today on behalf of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds Program here at Treasury. So as Jenny said, I'm Laura McDaniel, and I lead policy outreach for the SLFR program, which I'm sure you all are quite familiar with and was very clearly described, but it is, again, the $350 billion made available through the American Rescue Plan Act for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments in response to the COVID-19 public health crisis and its negative economic impacts. I'm particularly excited to be here with you today because this Saturday, March 11th, we celebrate the 2-year anniversary of this achievement. So I want to extend a thank you to all of you since its success owes greatly to the work you all have been doing on the ground with your communities every day. The American Rescue Plan Act provided critical support to millions of individuals and businesses as they recovered from the pandemic. It helped avert a deep and sustained economic downturn, possibly as severe as the Great Depression. And at the same time, it also laid a strong foundation for future economic growth. Thanks to the American Rescue Plan, countless cities, counties, states, and tribal nations across the country are on firmer economic footing emerging from the pandemic than they would otherwise have been without rescue plan resources. These economic recovery resources have also allowed local governments to make investments for the future in areas such as affordable housing and workforce development, rather than struggling to restore operations to normal levels. Finally, I want to note that Treasury's implementation of the American Rescue Plan has been thoughtful and intentional and in close coordination with local leaders to ensure maximum efficiency. Treasury also placed a particular focus on promoting an equitable economic recovery. So this is in recognition that historically underserved communities, including low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, experienced disproportionate impacts of the pandemic. So when implementing the SLFRF program, Treasury sought to encourage recipients to address economic disparities such as affordable housing, jobs, and access to childcare so that the recovery from the pandemic is truly an equitable recovery for everyone. So thanks again for having me here today as part of your conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Laura. We have some questions for you and hope you can take some time before you have to jump off. But would you be able to discuss? Some folks have been curious about your take on the upcoming official end of the public health emergency and its impact on ARPA spending.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we have been hearing this a bit, and I want to share that right now Treasury is considering the impact of the end of the public health emergency on SLFRF and what that will mean for program recipients. So for most eligible uses, recipients will be able to continue to make investments without changes. And currently, Treasury is working on a detailed FAQ about how the end of the public health emergency will impact different eligible use categories. So making sure that we spell that out clearly for everyone.
Thank you for that. Another question. How can we tie in ARPA funds with other federal investments coming down the pipeline, like IRA, BIL, and IJA, et cetera, for equitable community development?
So the way that, at least from the way that I understood this question, since so many of these, projects this is for long-term planning, I think the number one area that I'll focus on here will be around program administration. So I'm sure you all are familiar with the eligible uses of the program, but to reiterate, they are revenue loss, premium pay, the public health and negative economic impacts of the pandemic category, and finally the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure category. So recipients can use the funding, can use various sources of funding for projects, in multiple ways, and this includes but isn't limited to using funds available under the revenue loss category for non-federal match, pooling funds for a joint project with another SLFRF recipient, transferring funds to separate recipients to finance a project that also uses other sources of funding, and finally blending and braiding SLFRF funds with other sources of government funding, including debt issuance to pursue a project. So I'll add a link into the chat, but this is spelled out, in our FAQs. So another one I want to note is also that you can transfer the funds to other entities, as well as I mentioned before, pool regionally. So this is all in our FAQs 1.8 and 4.7 respectively. So those are some ways that you can these funds are really flexible and can pair well with other funds. And then going back to the eligible uses that I mentioned at the outset, under the public health and negative economic impact eligible use category, there is a wide variety of uses that recipients can engage in to support public sector capacity, including program administration. So to name a few examples from what recipients are, we're seeing recipients do in our reporting, this could include using funds for grant management, grant delivery, monitoring, and compliance, among other uses. So you'll want to review our guidance and FAQs for more detail for what that could look like in your particular community. But in terms of this program administration place, that's where I would say that would be a good place to start.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I know you said you were going to drop it in the chat. For our attendees, you will be able to access that link. And after the call, we'll be able to share that as well for folks who are actually registered with us. And we have one final comment here. We would like to know how to access funds for community organizing and base building activities in my own county. Are you able to enlighten us with some of that information?
Sure, sure. So, but one thing to think about with these funds is that, ARPA Act, it doesn't authorize Treasury to provide SLFRF funds directly, like to nonprofits or private organizations. However, and you'll see this in the final rule FAQs, I'll pull this out. We have guidance on how recipients can transfer funds to nonprofits and other organizations. So you'll want to, take a close look at this FAQ, but essentially, if you're looking for funds for these types of activities, you would need to seek them from the SLFRF recipients within your jurisdiction. So in the guidance, it's to give you a flavor of kind of what you'll see. It'll, indicate where, if the funds are transferred to you, where you might have to follow subrecipient reporting guidance. And then there's also some instances where you would be, where the organization would be considered a beneficiary under the program. So you'll want to look, kind of closely at the guidance, but that's the key way I would say here is to make sure that you work with your recipients within your jurisdiction for the funds.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your insight, for your expertise. We really appreciate it. And we have no more questions for you, and we also understand that you have to drop off. But if you'd like to go ahead and put that link in the chat and then depart, you are more than welcome. Thank you so much for your time and your insight, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.
Thanks again for having me here today, and I'll drop those things in the chat shortly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Now, please welcome to the stage, this virtual stage, of course, our Executive Director of SEAP, Sarah Beth Gale, who will be discussing ARP updates and resources overview. Sarah Beth, you are able to unmute.
Great. Thanks so much, Jenny. And thank you again, Laura, for joining us. Sarah Beth Gale, Executive Director of SEAP. And we're really excited to have everybody here this week because this is a week of celebration at SEAP on the second anniversary of the signing of the American Rescue Plan. And there's literally thousands of things to celebrate right now. Thousands of projects are already underway or budgeted with the state and local fiscal recovery funds. 3,200 projects supporting workers and premium pay, 1,800 projects focused on housing, 1,400 budgeted for public health. And there's such a variety of projects we're seeing, rural, urban, across issue areas, across political spectrums, and really having a short and long-term impact. I just threw up Layton, Alabama and Mobile, Alabama here to show kind of a rural and urban example. Layton, Alabama is meeting immediate needs, bill payment, food, clothing. Mobile, Alabama, a much larger place, looking for the long term and investing in affordable rental housing. So we're celebrating all week, and we hope you will as well, and tag ARP in Action 2023 if you're able to uplift great things that are happening in your community so that folks can see the impact of ARP in this week of celebration. Next slide. So those are the projects, but there's also cause to celebrate on the process side. So there have been some really great advances in equity and engagement practices. We highlighting Harris County, Texas here, who right from the get-go put out equity goals, said they were going to measure racial and ethnic disparities, close gaps, and also really look across county government for how they could support equity-centered solutions on an ongoing basis so that it wasn't just about ARP, but really long-term practices within the government. Again, we're seeing this in places that are really different politically. Take Durham, North Carolina, and Noonan, Georgia, which look very different politically, but are using the same exact equity scorecards to assess local projects. So a lot of great advances, a lot to celebrate. Next slide. But obviously there's more work to be done or we wouldn't be here today. So I'm excited to have y'all here. We're going to talk through some resources to help folks on the ground fighting for ARP dollars. I wanted to highlight a report we put out in December that has insights from a lot of folks who are actually on this call. Thank you for that. Looking at both what's working and what's challenging in these funds. And so local governments often lacked the internal capacity to engage communities deeply or stand up new programs. There was anxiety both among nonprofits, community-based organizations, and local governments about dealing with federal funds. And there were concerns among advocates about transparency. How much money is left on the table? What's happening in my community around these funds? Next slide. So SEAP produced the American Rescue Plan Toolkit. We have this on our website and have over these past 2 years populated it to try to spread best practices across the region, to build confidence among community leaders, elected officials, that they really could use the funds in this way, and to provide resources for advocates working in their communities. So I'm going to highlight a couple of the new resources that are on there to help out. Next slide. So one of the big barriers is particularly among small nonprofits and small local governments in accessing and managing funds often. And so we've gotten this question a lot of, are there models where funders can come in and bridge that gap? And so we put out this policy brief in January, just pulling together a couple of examples of how funders, and in the case of Los Angeles County, the county itself came in and stood up technical assistance programs to help small nonprofits and in some cases, smaller local governments really understand kind of the technical guidelines and the access and management of these federal funds. Sadly, both of the examples here are from California, but there's more examples in the brief. So if you're a funder on the call and you're interested in helping out, this is a great place to start. Or if you're an advocate that's trying to push a funder to help out in some way in the community and helping advocates and nonprofits around ARP, this is a great place to start as well. Next slide. So just this week, we released a revamped activist guide. So this includes updated links to resources, sample letters and talking points, steps around organizing around ARP, and then examples of organizing campaigns that are going on, including some of the speakers on this call today. So if you're just gearing up around what is the opportunity here, this would be the place to start. And it has a lot of the links into what we're going to talk about today. Next slide. And then we also have provided just this week some one-pagers just highlighting cool projects that are happening across the South in a variety of rural and urban settings. We had a partner in Mississippi who said elected officials, county commissioners were coming up to him in the grocery store and saying, you know, I really don't know what to do with these funds. You got to give me some ideas. And so we've tried to look across issue areas. And this is one way that we can really support local officials in building confidence that other communities are using the funds in this way. You're not stepping out on a limb here, and there's a really wide variety of uses for these. There's a lot of issue areas here, but if you're interested in a particular issue area and we haven't covered it, reach out to us. We're happy to search around, find examples that can really help you in your campaign. Next slide. Typically, the first question we get, though, from advocates who are interested in working on this is there any money left on the table? Should I even be focusing my time on this? So we at SEAP focus mostly on the local level, the cities and counties receiving these funds. But I wanted to highlight this resource from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They've been tracking the state level funds. So the link is in here when you get it. There's a lot more information in the report that is linked there. But as of December, there's about 13% of funds left in the state pool, so $25 billion. That varies a lot by state. Some have budgeted 100%. Nevada, on the other end, has budgeted 46% as of December. But I do want to highlight, even if your state's at 100%, there can still be an opportunity to advocate. Sometimes these funds are budgeted in kind of a general way, like housing. So there is often an opportunity to come in the implementation phase and really help think through the distribution of funds and the actual projects themselves that are going to be undertaken at the state level. Next slide. So finally, on my end, I'm going to pass this back to Jenny to pass to Maria. But at SEAP, we've released a local fund spending tracker. And so we had one last year that looked at 5 states. The new tracker is all 50 states. And so this includes a wealth of information so folks can find out what's happening in their community. And it really varies, again, community by community. So we're excited to provide this resource for folks to really dig deep and see both within their community what funds are available, but also in other communities, what projects are out there that might be replicated in their community as well. So I will pass this back to Jenny and look forward to Q&A later on.
Thanks so much, Sarah Beth. We really appreciate it. As Sarah Beth mentioned, we will have a Q&A section. So if you are wanting to put in a question now, you are able to in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now we will have SEAP's Data Director, Maria Filippelli, to provide insight on the ARP Tracker and Community Needs Survey preliminary results. Maria, you are able to unmute.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jenny. And thanks so much, everybody, for being on the call today. I get to talk about one of my favorite things, which is data. As Jenny mentioned, I'm Maria Filippelli, Data Director for SEAP. And today I'm going to review a few updates that we've made to our ARP spending tracker and a few other data resources that are available. So the ARP spending tracker, the initial launch was around this time last year. As Sarah Beth mentioned, there was a spending tracker that had about 5 states. But this new, the updates to the spending tracker, which came out at the end of July, I'm sorry, the end of January, so just about 5 or 6 weeks ago, includes data for all 50 states. And in this spending tracker, we are focusing specifically on the state and local fiscal recovery funds program. And one of the, or there's 2 big updates to this tracker. So one of them is that we have a call out for claiming the standard revenue allowance. So this is an option that local governments can take. You know, they can put, they can claim up to $10 million without much reporting or information, but it is an option they can have. So that's something we called out. And we also have a call out for funds remaining. So the calculation that we used for this field is we took for every local government, we added up the cumulative obligations for each project that they had listed, and we subtracted that from the allocation that they had available. And so that's how we came to funds remaining. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to show, I have this slide and the next slide are 2 different examples. So on this slide, we have an example for Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville, Alabama falls into the tier 1 and tier 2 reporting tiers. So they're places that are over 250,000 people. They received more than $10 million in SLFRF funds. So when you go to the tracker, you can select a state and a city or county. For Huntsville here, we can see their spending by category is largely in 2 areas. It's to reduce the negative economic impacts and revenue replacement. They are not claiming the standard allowance. And as of the end of September, they have about $1.6 million remaining. And on the tracker, if you just kind of scroll down a little bit, you'll get to the project detail, which on the slide is on the lower right-hand side. So you can see for each location, the project name and some details and their cumulative obligations for each project level. So this is tier 1 and 2 data. Tier 1 and 2 recipients have to provide reports to Treasury every quarter. So the last time data was provided was for the December 31st, 2022. That data is not available yet. So I did just check it this morning. So right now, this is the most up-to-date data for tier 1 and 2 locations. If we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so our second example is for tier 5 locations. So these are smaller locations. They're under 250,000 people. They receive less than $10 million. And so they look a little bit different. They only have to report once each year. So the data here is for the reporting period of March 3rd, 2021 through March 31st, 2022. So this is only the first half of allocations because the second half of allocations wasn't administered until May and June of 2022. So these small locations, first half of allocations, but very similar information. So the example we're using here is Natchez, Mississippi. They are claiming the standard allowance. They do have some funds remaining from the first half of the allocation they received, largely revenue replacement projects. And then very similarly, the project detail is available when you scroll down on the tracker and you can see where the funds are being spent. So those are our trackers. And, happy to take any questions about that during our Q&A. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Sarah Beth mentioned, and I think, was mentioned in the beginning, equity and engagement and outreach are really cornerstones of ARP, and they're big priorities for subsequent federal legislation, whether that was infrastructure or IRA, or CHIPS, or any of these big bills that are coming out. So in 2022, SEAP really wanted to see if the dollars being spent and the dollars being budgeted and allocated were really meeting the needs of some of the most underserved communities. So we promoted a survey to food insecure households in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. And we asked a number of questions, but just a couple of highlights here. When we asked about the top personal challenges, so what was challenging to individuals, to their households during the pandemic and up until that point in time, which was early 2022, they said the top challenges were ability to pay utilities, gas, broadband, electric, and personal debt. So personal debt included medical, student loan, credit card, really just any kind of debt. And then when we asked, where should funds go in your community, affordable housing far and away was the number one area where people really wanted to see ARP funds invested. And then second to that was more affordable utilities. And because outreach and engagement were so important for ARP, we did ask, has anybody reached out to you? Has your mayor, county supervisor, alderperson, even any community leader reached out? And 90% of respondents said, no one has reached out to them about the ARP funds. So moving forward 1 year, we wanted to do a little bit of a temperature check, see if needs in communities were potentially still the same. We brought in the survey a little bit to go beyond just ARP, because again, we know infrastructure and some other funding packages are important to communities and the funds can be braided together. So we just sort of put a more general spin on the survey, but again, promoting it to food insecure households. Here, now we're in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Tennessee, and we're seeing some very similar things, and then one very different thing. So top personal challenges, pretty similar, the ability to pay utilities, unfortunately unsurprising there, because I think utilities are going up across the board. Close second to paying utilities is personal debt, and the ability to afford housing. So those are really the top challenges we're seeing now. Where funds should go in the community, once again, creating more affordable housing is still number one. But the big change here is that now we're seeing food access and affordability becoming increasingly challenging for folks, and a place where communities really want to see the money go, because it is such a large part of budgets these days. And so, we'll keep an eye on that. The survey has about another month being live. And then we'll do a full report in April, maybe early May. Oh yeah, and then this last thing here, we're also seeing once again that, folks aren't hearing from community leaders and elected officials about participation in discussions about where they think the funds should go. Also knowing, there's 6 states on this slide. Happy to talk to any state partners on the call that are in these states and maybe want a more detailed breakdown. We've done that for some groups before. Happy to do it again. Just please feel free to reach out to SEAP for that. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is my last slide here. I just wanted to highlight 2 more data resources. So one is pandemicoversight.gov. We're talking a lot today about ARP and specifically the state and local fiscal recovery funds. Pandemicoversight.gov has data on all of the pandemic relief funds. So if you want to see some other programs from ARP or CARES or Paycheck Protection Program, you can find a lot of that information there by program, by state. They're putting up new information and articles every day. So that's a really good site to check out. as well for pandemic relief information. Super excited about the second link here. So about a month ago, the Biden-Harris administration put out this bipartisan infrastructure law maps and dashboards. So what's really great about these is they're updating it monthly. So it's updated, the information on there is relevant as of mid-February, so just a couple weeks ago. But what they're showing here and what they have available here is both discretionary funds and discretionary grants, so where those competitive grants are going, and also formula funds and grants. So you can kind of look to see at the state level or by program where the funding is going. They also have this blue map on the slide. I know it's a little bit tricky to see, but there is funding totals by state. So you can also go to your state, look at the funding totals, see total dollar amounts for infrastructure or climate or other issue areas, and also see what agencies that funding is coming from. So this is a really, really helpful and useful tool for some infrastructure data. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Maria. We really appreciate your insight. And for more information, we've put the link of the new tracker in the chat, and we will also be following up with more information and more of these links that you can get once the program is over. As a reminder for the folks in the attendee pool, we are taking questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function on here. A special shout out to the folks that are watching on Facebook and YouTube, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. We are glad to have such an amazing program today with amazing partners in this work. We will now welcome Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, President and CEO of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia ACT. Dr. Bambi has 25 years of experience in rural and urban housing, community and economic development, and serves on numerous boards and advisory committees. We also have Sherelle Bird, who is here with us from Southwest Georgia Rising, founder and executive director, a native of Albany, Georgia, who has spent her career building her expertise in event planning, nonprofit management, and fund development. And we are also joined by Nellie Katzen, Executive Director of Committee for a Better New Orleans, who is a convener, connector, and capacity builder. From boardrooms to crawfish boils, Nellie seeks to create meaningful relationships to drive social change. We now welcome them all to talk a little bit about how ARP has been showing up in the South. You are all able to unmute and start speaking.
All right, well, I will start. Good afternoon and happy International Women's Day. I'm so excited to be on this panel with such amazing, powerful women that are doing great things in their communities. As she said, I'm Sherelle Bird. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Georgia Rising, and our mission is to mobilize people and resources to improve the quality of life for marginalized communities in Southwest Georgia. And so we saw this as a great opportunity to do exactly that. For many who aren't familiar with how COVID-19 impacted Southwest Georgia, Albany was actually a COVID epicenter during the pandemic, and that really just pervaded throughout all of Southwest Georgia. Many communities were hit hard in the region. And so when we learned about the ARP funding that was coming down to communities, we saw this as a pivotal way for our organization to reach down into our work and really make an impact and help communities prepare for this funding that was coming. One of the first things that we really saw at the very beginning of this was a lot of communities just simply weren't aware that this money was headed to their communities, and were a little skeptical, right? They were like, no, we were telling them millions of dollars was coming, but people just did not realize that this was actually real. And so a lot of people, some people knew in communities, but things were really happening in vacuums. And so we wanted to put together a concerted effort to provide technical assistance assistance to communities to ensure that they understood how ARP would be applied, also that they understood the language around not only ARP, but as well as advancing racial equity for underserved communities, which was kind of a companion act with ARP. And so one of the first things we did was we brought together leaders on a call that we called kind of our Economic Alliance call for Southwest Georgia. This was a group of faith-based leaders, community leaders, as well as political leaders that were a part of smaller municipalities across the region. And we brought them all on a call. Around that time, we were all using Zoom. And so it was a great way to get everyone in one space together to have this really important conversation. And so through that call, we were able to do things like have needs assessments to really pull out of those communities, like, what do you need right now, so that this money could be applied in a very intentional and transformative way. And we, again, gave them all of the information. This is how this money can be used. Here are all the ways that, the president wants to see this money applied in your communities. We also, while that was a great way to get people together, we knew that there were other communities that we just were not reaching. And so we partnered with Georgia Act, and I think Dr. Bambi may talk about this in her presentation. We partnered with them in Fresh to create a tour that allowed us to go into rural communities and host town halls, because it was very important that we also made sure that community, just regular folks in communities, understood how this money was coming down and how they can apply it to their community so that they could speak up and show up at commission meetings and show up at council meetings and tell their leaders how they wanted to see this money applied in their communities. So I really do feel like that was very effective. One of the things we were very proud of seeing was a lot of organizations, as well as faith-based leaders, started putting in proposals to their local communities. And a lot of these local communities were very surprised that people were informed enough to be able to be empowered to go to show up at their council meetings and say, hey, we need this money and this is what we need this money for. And they were very intentional about that. And so that was very exciting. One of the other things that we received were lots of requests from local municipalities and from commissioners and councilmen wanting us to come to their actual meetings to make sure that this was read into public record. And that was so important because we wanted to make sure that even if people weren't at commission meetings, that they can go back and pull public records and learn about what this money should be used for and how it could be applied to their communities. So we saw some really great uses of this money. We saw things like after school programs that were starting to come up. We knew that there was a significant learning slump during COVID-19. And so we had one community that put together a proposal that would bring together local church groups with nonprofits to be able to do after school programs. We saw another community that was able to provide salaries to lower wage essential workers that really allowed them to be able to just kind of get through the pandemic when a lot of them were really struggling around that time. And then we saw a couple of communities in our region also put together small business recovery programs that were able to help a lot of the particularly minority businesses that we saw. I think like 41% of Black and minority businesses shuttered their doors during the pandemic. And so they used a lot of this funding to be able to help those businesses recover. But unfortunately, most of what we saw was this money being sunk into infrastructure. And one community example is my own, and that's Albany. There were a lot of people that came out in Albany to really come and say, we need this money for things like food security and for recreation and for housing and all of these needs that we knew were coming down the pipe as a part of COVID recovery. But because there was a major sewer CSO project that was on the verge of happening in our community, $22 million that came to the city of Albany, all of that money, they wanted to put every dime of it into the sewer. In a community that really, really, really was hit hard by COVID and really, really, really needed to recover. Unfortunately, we saw this our community make the decision to put that money into COVID recovery. So it was a very, very unfortunate, put it into the sewer project. So it was very unfortunate to see. A lot of people were very upset. But people kept showing up to the commission meetings and talking to their leaders and letting them know some of this money has to go back to the people, which is what it was intended for. And so I'm happy to say at least 2 million of that money, we were told recently, that would potentially go back to the community. But one of the things we really wanted to make sure communities knew, especially the ones that we were hearing that wanted to put this money towards infrastructure, is that there was other money coming behind ARP for infrastructure. We knew the governor had a state fiscal recovery fund that would be opening. We knew that the bipartisan infrastructure act would be coming about a year or so later. We were hearing these things were coming. So we're really urging our leaders to put this money back, take this money, put it back into the community, and then wait for the money that was coming to apply that to infrastructure. So I just want to talk about a couple of challenges really quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Bamby. But two of the main challenges that we saw with this funding was the political climate that we were in at the time when this money did come down really made it difficult because there was not bipartisan support, and that trickled down into smaller communities and municipalities. And because there was not bipartisan support, a lot of people did not create COVID recovery plans. So when this money came, there was no sound plans about how to apply this money to really be transformative in these communities. So right now, a lot of communities are still continuing to suffer. People are still having problems with evictions, with foreclosures, with businesses still continuing to be shuttered. And so had there been a plan in place by a lot of these communities, we could have eliminated a lot of these issues that we're seeing even today. Then the other thing is, while this was great intent by our president, we truly appreciate the intent. But unfortunately, I think when the end of this is done, there's going to be a lot of hopefully debriefing that happens about how this money was applied. And the one thing that we saw was a major issue was the discretion that was given in this act for a lot of people to be able to apply this, not just for the things that were outlined in the act, but the discretion to do other things with it. And that was the teeth that we didn't have in this act that allowed people to use that kind of as a loophole to be able to apply this towards infrastructure. And so we were hearing people saying things like, these Biden bucks are coming down, and so we're just going to dump the Biden bucks into buildings and infrastructure and sewer and things like that, and really not taking this seriously and not seeing this as a way to advance equity, to help historically underserved communities, and to really just help communities recover from COVID as it was intended to do. So that's some of the work that we were doing on the ground. Really proud of the communities that were able to fight for this funding to be applied to help their communities. But I know there's still so much more work to be done. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bamby to talk a little bit more about their work at Georgia Act. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sherelle. And Sherelle and Sawega Rising has been a wonderful partner throughout this process. And as Ms. Bird alluded to, this was quite a heavy lift, but we were very steadfast in getting this information out to the communities. Dr. Bamby Hayes Brown, I serve as President and Chief Executive Officer of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia Act. Next slide. And we are a statewide nonprofit affordable housing agency that represents the state's nonprofit and community development agencies. And our mission is to build, support, and inform a statewide network of thriving organizations, professionals, and individuals advancing equitable housing and community development. And our vision is for all Georgia families to have safe and decent housing in vibrant neighborhoods. Next slide. And as Ms. Bird stated, Georgia Act, Sawega Rising, and Fresh Communities, that is based out of Waycross, also in partnership with the Fort Valley State University, which is a historically Black college and university in Fort Valley, Georgia, along with numerous other partners, embarked on what we call the 3V Liberation Tour, and the V stands for Votes, Vaccines, and Vision. And the vision part of the tour related to those town hall meetings. And as Ms. Bird stated, we went into 42 different cities throughout South Georgia, because we do understand that with so many of these American Rescue Plan dollars and federal dollars, state dollars, any type of government dollars tend to go to those more heavily populated areas, such as Atlanta. So we want to be intentional in focusing on those communities that are below Interstate 16, as we say. But this is one of the town hall meetings that we held in Fitzgerald, Georgia, where we were able to inform elected officials and community leaders about the usage of the dollars. So as Ms. Bird stated, so many communities, so many elected officials only thought that it was infrastructure, or they thought that they had no say so in how those funds would be spent. So they really relied on county administrators, city managers to give them an idea of how to spend the money instead of using a bottom-up approach. And so we were very intentional in doing that throughout the state of Georgia. And this is an example of Fitzgerald, Georgia, where we saw a lot of those federal dollars to go towards rural broadband. Even though infrastructure, water and sewer is a significant need, we did want to inform them that we knew that those dollars would be forthcoming, and to allow these more flexible dollars to be used for those things that are much needed in the communities, such as rural broadband that we saw that was a significant problem with school children during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. We also have a picture here in Dawson, Georgia, and that is a small town in Southwest Georgia. Their most famous member is Otis Redding, who was born near Dawson in Terrell County. And as a part of the town hall meeting, we didn't just wait for people to come to us. We actually went into the community. So Georgia Act, Fresh Communities, you see the Fort Valley State University training trailer actually went into the community in a parking lot where we met with people with this parking lot of a old grocery store, where we did some strategic planning on how people can, how the citizens would like to see those American Rescue Plan dollars spent. And as you see, we had food, we had healthcare services where people also were able to access vaccines, which is another thing that we wanted to make available to people, and working in partnership with the local hospitals, health systems, health departments that were able to get those American Rescue Plans dollars to provide that vaccine access for individuals. Next slide. Okay. Yes. Before we go forward, I do want to mention a few more things. There was also in some other counties we saw where there was a significant need for utility assistance. And in the southern part of Georgia, we're talking about poverty rates of 36, 40, 45, 50% poverty in those counties and cities and in those municipalities. So a lot of things that they talked about was programs for youth, because as we say in South Georgia, as a South Georgia native, a lot of times there's nothing for youth to do. So they were home, and so they were looking for those programs and services in addition to those access to lost learning for our youth. There was also other municipalities that looked at aid to small businesses. So that was something I was so glad that Southwest Georgia really was the pilot and led the way in providing those American Rescue Plan dollars for small businesses, especially for Black-owned, small Black and minority women-owned small businesses. And so we saw that as a common theme throughout Georgia. Then the governor had $4 billion in discretionary funds that he could use for that negative economic impact. And we did have organizations as well as municipalities did apply for those $4 billion. And the governor did award some to the continuums of care that were able to address homelessness, for rental and supportive housing for those with persistent and severe mental illness, and also weatherization programs for senior citizens. And then there was another county in North Georgia who partnered with their local Habitat for Humanity affiliate. So they were able to donate their city and county owned land. And so we do know that here in Georgia, we have a land bank authority, and looking at those eligible uses of land. So this particular county was able to partner with Habitat, use their locally owned land in order to build affordable housing for their essential workers. So this puts people, now we talk a lot about rental, but this also gave a home ownership component for teachers and firefighters, for them to be able to afford to live in the communities and where they work. And in closing, we did continue to see more and more communities, municipalities reach out to us. The partnership that we built with Sawega Rising, Fresh Communities, and so many others that want us to continue to come back into the communities to help them develop those plans, not only for the American Rescue Plan dollars, but any other programs or federal or state or local funds that they receive into the community. So it's very important that we did that civic engagement so that people understand and know the power that they have as a collective, and that we have to hold our elected officials accountable for addressing the needs of the people, hearing from the people, and implementing those plans. And now I'll turn it over to Nellie.
Thanks so much. It's really exciting to see what else is going on a statewide level. My name is Nellie Katzen. I'm the executive director of the Committee for a Better New Orleans. So I'll be speaking to our experience in New Orleans at the municipal level. This work has come to take shape as a campaign we're calling Building Our Future, to make sure that residents and the city are able to work together on decisions around federal money. I'll zoom out and give a little bit of, zoom in and give a little bit of local context to what we're dealing with. I imagine that some of these look familiar for your own communities. New Orleans is a tourism-based economy, and so we suffered greatly as a result of the pandemic. It has felt literally and metaphysically like we have been in a rut. The atmosphere around town, really since the fall of the pandemic, has been in a rut. We had a bad track record on completing projects. In 2022, the city had 71 open roadwork projects that were not being worked on, which led to massive distrust, which we started measuring and found that on a scale of 0 to 10, the city had more opinions below 0 than above 5. So we knew that the trust around building out people's needs with these funds was going to be a barrier. We had staffing shortages, we had budget cuts, and in the end of 2021, Hurricane Ida made landfall as the 3rd strongest to hit Louisiana on record. So that is what we were dealing with. I'm sure that it mirrors some of the challenges that you've been seeing in your communities. We're facing serious inequities and trying to build from there. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about our American Rescue Plan story. Committee for a Better New Orleans helps people understand, navigate, and influence the decisions that impact them. Budget education has been a strength of ours, as has resident engagement in big planning decisions after disasters like this one. So we'll talk a little bit about our story, how we got involved with this work, and where we went. We'll talk about where we go from here, and then briefly I'll talk about some of the challenges and contradictions that we're still working to balance as we move forward. Next slide, please. So CBNO is a 55-year-old organization. We work to build healthy soil for New Orleans grassroots. When it came to the American Rescue Plan, we were pushing for equity, but also to help people understand, navigate, and influence these funds themselves, giving the grassroots the tools that they needed to engage, as well as an awareness of where the ball was, which was hard to track, but really impactful. Pictured here is the first community stakeholder meeting that we had. We had 3 of these meetings around different areas of town, but didn't stop there. We were also educating folks, giving resources, webinars, translating some of the information that SEAP provided to infuse it into our grassroots here. We had webinars on how what this money is for, the fact that it was coming and how much was coming. We had trainings, we crunched data that wasn't readily readable from city sources, and we broadcasted opportunities for folks to get involved. I'll speak a little bit more to some of our successes on the next slide. So we started out really strong. There was clear, when New Orleans was in the headlines at the beginning of the pandemic as kind of the epicenter of health inequity for several months. It was here that the studies were made showing that Black people were 70% more likely to die from this disease. And of course, the economic effects were having rippling effects, exacerbating existing disparity. So we were successfully able to use the model resolution through South Strong that SEAP provided and get that passed by our city council, showing that the city of New Orleans really believes in the values laid out here of equity, inclusivity, transparency, and accountability. They also passed an ordinance to that effect, requiring transparency and accountability in early 2022. That ordinance required that the city create a dashboard for their progress on American Rescue Plan, not just on value, dollars spent, but also on success metrics. What did we get with that money that we spent? They were also required to provide monthly updates to our city council budget committee. Drum roll, please. Did it happen? Sorry, back one more. Thank you. Unfortunately, despite this, it was really hard to keep folks engaged. Had we not been there helping to bring advocates together and bring the information back and forth, it would have been really difficult for our grassroots communities to coordinate. Around the screen here, you can see sort of the way that priorities shifted. If you put your attention on the blue segment of each of these graphs, the initial projections was about $42 million of our total 388 for public safety. By October of 2022, that grew to 80. And by the time all was said and done in February of 2023, 266 million, more than half of our total allocation was put towards public safety, the majority of which was put into the NOPD. The lack of transparency created a lot of challenges for residents on the ground, as well as advocates and organizers, because the city was relying on their existing budget process, which did not already provide sufficient opportunities for input. They really lacked a two-way public process to lean on. I can leave it there. By lacking that transparency, it meant that people who did want to advocate for certain uses, especially folks advocating for investment in community rather just in the response to crime, invest in the causes, in resolving the causes of crime, that was largely unheard in the early allocation process. But that's not all. As of yet, most of this money has not been spent. And so our advocacy and education efforts in bringing stakeholders onto the same page resulted in, you can flip slides, in massive community awareness. We did a campaign where we were doing education in front of communities, at existing community groups, at parties, at second lines, wherever we could get, and train thousands of people about the opportunity that this funding could present for our communities. By coordinating and educating advocates, we led community into a strong, unified, and community-driven proposal for the second tranche of the American Rescue Funds. While the city initially did not adhere to their own goals around equity and transparency, we do still have wins on the horizon. We're working with over 70 partners to get a process actually put forward. So there hasn't been a public process. We collected and sent, with very little prompting, 8 proposals to the city of New Orleans for how they should use funds. And our education led to dozens of other proposals. We are meeting with City Council Budget Committee on the 4th of next month to talk through what a process should look like to move this money towards the direction that the community really needs to see it go. You can switch to the next slide, please. So some of the overall reflections on the American Rescue Plan it definitely turned out to be a lesson to learn from as we move forward and pursue bigger pots of funding. The city of New Orleans failed to get the process right, but we did prove that the people are watching by getting folks engaged in budget decisions that usually get ignored and don't even get news coverage. We put it front and center and brought it into community where they were. We rebuilt coalitions and connections that had atrophied during the pandemic that we're going to need in order to work together. That's both outside in the thousands of nonprofits that exist in New Orleans, but also with city and community leaders. We gathered residents' data and stories and converted that into usable metrics that the city could use. And we discovered process and funding gaps that prevent us from reaching our equity goals as a city, regardless of where they're derived. So where we go next, if you could flip slides, is we're putting these lessons directly into work for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In New Orleans, we like to call everything different. We call it IJA. Most places are calling it Bill. We're talking about the bipartisan infrastructure law. We knew that if we were going to learn from the American Rescue Plan and apply these lessons, we had to start now. So we actually were able to work within our coalition to transfer leadership on the American Rescue Plan proposals so that CBNO could focus on getting prepared for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There is potentially billions of dollars that could come down to our communities, and potentially we could get none of it in the grant funded categories. Fortunately, Justice 40 means that we and a lot of us in the South should be very well positioned to win funds under this. We want to make sure that the city of New Orleans is prepared to receive as much of this money as possible and to build out our strategy for spending it equitably, something that we failed to accomplish so far for the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please. So the way we're doing that is we're educating, we're gathering priorities, and we're strengthening the city of New Orleans proposals for this funding. I'll focus in on that third one because it's the piece that we're starting now and are most proud of. We're creating an equity framework that links city plans with Justice 40 and other funding guidance to be able to actually create actionable recommendations for the city of New Orleans to implement equity. We've been talking about it for a really long time. We know where the challenges are. And so we've been working to bring city partners, advocates, and community residents to the table to develop a better process for how we'll use federal funds going forward and creating an equity strategy. Next slide, please. There's a lot of tensions in this work that I wanted to name. The SEAP resources have done, I think, a really good job at naming these tensions, putting them out there, and helping to think through strategies of how to work through and around them. Here's some of the tensions that are really prevailing in our work. The tension around trust. Both we can't rely on the city to do it right, and why should I be doing the city's job? Fatigue of being engaged. We've said this a million times versus nobody asked me. We're responding to that by synthesizing and using data. You don't understand our problems versus less studies, more action. We're using that by having many touches with people at all levels of change and coordinating to move forward together. Finally, I'm sure that we're behind on time here. Some of the needs that we noticed going forward are funding for coordination and new approaches. There's a lot of this work happening in silos, the housing people, the transportation people, the so on and so forth. But knitting all of these pieces together is going to be really important as we look after bigger pots of funding and spending this in a thoughtful way. Follow through and accountability are a major challenge for us here. Even when we're able to get the vision expressed, get the stage, the follow through isn't there, and it's hard to measure how it works. One of the things I've really been interested in and would love to have conversations if anybody else is exploring this is evaluation. If we can't measure our equity goals, we can't manage them. So we've been working on developing evaluation tools, and that's something I'm seeing as a great need for moving forward here. And finally, trust building and collaboration, bringing folks to the table, because we're really not going to be able to do this without each other. I will stop there. The next slide has my contact information. I know that we are tight on time, so I will leave it for questions.
Thank you so much, Nellie, Dr. Bambi, and Sherelle. We were really happy that you all were able to join us today. We are now going to hear from the team at the data center. Alicia Rashid is a policy and data consultant focusing on building a more equitable society. Allison Plyer is the chief demographer and is recognized as an international expert in demographics and disaster recovery trends. We welcome you both to unmute and begin your portion of today's webinar.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jenny, for that introduction, and thank you to SEAP for having us here today. We're thankful to be in such good company and to hear about all of the great ways that communities have already made use of ARP funding dollars. We'll be focusing our time today on data that can help inform communities further, but before we share the data, we're going to start with a bit of background and context on our work. So Pandemic to Prosperity is an effort of the National Conference on Citizenship that builds on the data center's post-Katrina experience to disseminate data that reflects the lived experiences of marginalized communities in a rapidly changing environment. Next slide. Pandemic to Prosperity South was created to support people and organizations looking to understand how the COVID health and economic crises have impacted Southerners and to inform how federal resources are spent in their communities. We disseminate Pandemic to Prosperity directly to organizations across the South to help them advocate for their communities as states and localities make decisions about how things like American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law funds are invested. Next slide. So before we take a look at the indicators, I'll just note that for this report series, the South is defined as the 12 states that you see highlighted here in purple. And these are the same 12 Southern states that SEAP supports with its work. And next slide. And in this map, we see the counties where racial or ethnic groups make up a greater share of the county's population than the national average. So in purple, we see here the Black Belt region, which stretches from Virginia to Louisiana and has unique demographic makeup. So vestiges of a violent history of enslaving millions on cotton and tobacco plantations located there. We can also see the Appalachian region from northern Alabama to West Virginia, which has been long dominated by extractive industries such as coal mining. As a whole, these 12 states have struggled from a history of underinvestment in transportation, infrastructure, education, and job training, and still have among the highest poverty rates in the United States today. Next slide, please. So these are the indicators that we're going to focus on today. And we picked these ones specifically because we feel that they can be used to really inform ARP or bipartisan infrastructure law funding decisions. The indicators listed here are the ones we'll cover, and we'll show maps covering the whole US, but at the very end, we'll point you to how you can get these data points for your specific state or county using easy to use slides and spreadsheets that are located on our website. So stay tuned for that at the end of the presentation. And with that, we will kick it off to the next slide to start going through the data. So at least 1 in 4 renters in Louisiana, Florida, West Virginia, Mississippi, and South Carolina pay the majority of their income for housing. Rents have risen 4 times higher than incomes over the last 2 decades, and median rents reached a record high of more than $2,000 per month in August 2022. Having to spend the majority of income on rent means that families have less for food, clothing, and medical care. Housing cost burdens disproportionately affect Black and Hispanic renters. For example, a 2018 study found that Black households were more likely to pay higher rent prices than their white counterparts for identical housing in the same neighborhoods. Since COVID hit, Americans' housing insecurity grew more severe, as you'll see in the next slide. We can move to the next. This past December in 2022, 35% of Americans who were past due on rent or mortgage feared that eviction or foreclosure was likely. Among Southern states, fears were particularly high in Mississippi, West Virginia, Florida, and South Carolina, where about half of these families feared losing their homes. Across Southern states, only 1% of American Rescue Plan funds have been dedicated to housing as of December 2022, compared to 11% across the rest of the nation. Next slide, please. And so here we look at how home energy cost burdens, which relates to utility spending, which you know was mentioned as something that a lot of folks across the South are concerned about. So before the pandemic, low-income households in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi spent 10% or more of their income on energy costs. In November of 2021, a SEAP survey of 3,500 SNAP recipients in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and New Orleans ranked utility costs as their greatest concern above access to internet, affordable housing, employment, healthcare, or childcare. More efficient lighting and appliances and home insulation can cut electric consumption by up to 1/3. Communities can also use ARP funds for utility assistance and weatherization programs. The bipartisan infrastructure law will allow states and territories to access $3.1 billion in funding to install insulation, update heating and cooling systems, and upgrade appliances to reduce utility bills for households with low incomes. Next slide, please. Nearly 1 in 5 adults with children under 5 experienced a childcare disruption in the summer of 2022, which is the most recent data available. As a result, 1.6 million took unpaid leave, nearly 2 million parents cut work hours, and just over 1.6 million left or lost a job. American Rescue Plan dollars can be used to shore up the child care sector temporarily, but the challenge will be how to leverage these one-time investments to stabilize the workforce long-term. Next slide, please. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Allison Plyer, to carry us through the rest of the data.
Thank you so much, Alicia. So looking at medical debt, about 17% of Southerners have medical debt in collections compared to only 11% of folks outside the South. 7 Southern states indicated by the X's on the map have failed to implement Medicaid expansion, which has contributed to higher medical debt for their residents. These states could reduce medical debt levels just by adopting Medicaid expansion. But regardless, states and localities can use ARP funds to pay off residents' medical debts. The New Orleans City Council has one good use of their ARP funds. They set aside $1.3 million to erase $130 million in medical debt for New Orleans residents. The money would go to a national nonprofit called RIP Medical Debt that buys the medical debt for like pennies on the dollar and then forgives the debt. Next slide, please. Giving birth can be life-threatening, as many of us know, and the rate of pregnancy-related deaths in the US is 3 times higher than in all other wealthy countries. And on top of that, pregnancy-related deaths are 66% more common in the South than in the rest of the nation. Pregnancy-related deaths are also 2.6 times higher for Black Americans than for white Americans. The American Rescue Plan Act includes a Medicaid option to extend postpartum care from 60 days to 12 months after giving birth. 10 Southern states have already implemented this extension, and Mississippi has legislation that's pending for the extension. Only Arkansas has not yet acted on this opportunity. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about some of the issues that can be addressed by funding coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law, because as Nellie said, that's coming down the pike now. So a good one for folks to keep in mind. Internet access. 21% of Southern counties have poor internet access, which is defined as at least 1 in 4 households not having internet or not even cell phones. In Mississippi, 19% of households lack internet or cell phones. And in Arkansas, West Virginia, and Louisiana, it's 16% of households. The bipartisan infrastructure law is sending over $42 billion directly to states who are supposed to work in partnership with local communities to expand broadband access. And this is a really important opportunity for local advocates to have their voice heard about the investment of those funds. Next slide, please. Severe weather frequently leaves us Southerners in the dark, like last Friday when a storm left 5 people dead and thousands without power across Kentucky. It's a stark reminder of how fragile our infrastructure is, our power grid. As these events that happen cover a wider swath of the country, the nation has sort of a checkerboard power grid that means energy can't travel to the damaged area from an unaffected area. And a more unified system would really make the US energy infrastructure more resilient. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is another one that has a lot of federal funding coming, has funding to increase the development of the US electricity infrastructure and is one to keep your eyes on. The next slide, please. Earlier, we heard that some of the ARP funding went to infrastructure, and that's unfortunate because this infrastructure money is coming, as folks pointed out. So often, it could be an opportunity to point decision makers away from ARP and toward the infrastructure funding to address these issues like water issues. We know, for example, in Jackson, Mississippi, there's been a water crisis. It's really helped us to see that our water infrastructure really is aging. Most recently, we've had state-by-state report cards from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and they gave both Mississippi and West Virginia Ds because those states lose up to 50% of their treated water through leaks in their aging water infrastructure. And Louisiana received the lowest grade of all, D-, with systems that frequently struggle to meet demand for drinkable water. And those of us who live in Louisiana know that's true. On the other end of the spectrum, Georgia actually got a B- because they've already got pretty widespread use of new technologies like smart pressure reducing valves, and recently they have drought protection mandates such as water efficient fixtures in all new construction. But some Georgia towns are learning that drinking water is contaminated with forever chemicals from nearby industry. And the bipartisan infrastructure law is really the prime opportunity to address some of these issues. It will provide important new investments in replacing lead pipes, addressing contaminants, et cetera, all of which is funneled through, or most of which will be funneled through state programs. So it's important to keep your eye on those state programs. Next slide, please. One thing we want to point out about both, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act is that together they're predicted to create millions of new jobs in this coming decade, which is exciting, right? But already the nation has exceeded its previous record of jobs, 153.7 million. And now we have a new problem, which is we have job openings that outstrip job seekers 2 to 1. And a lot of that has to do because of death and illness. 400,000 working age people died due to COVID and other death rates that have spiked since COVID, like overdoses, suicides, and as mentioned, pregnancy-related deaths. Long COVID has also sidelined about 4.3 million workers. And as Alicia mentioned, lack of childcare kept 1 million parents from looking for work last year. So making sure that Americans are healthy and have the family care they need will be critical to ensure we have enough workers for all these jobs that we're creating. In addition, helping workers to transition from old industries to new sustainable industries is going to require a lot of substantial retooling and updating of workforce development systems. And those are all things we can do with American Rescue Plan dollars. So on the last slide, you'll see our website. And as Alicia mentioned, you can find the full report there. And also we have state-by-state slide decks. So for each Southern state, you can download a slide deck that's tailor-made for your state. They're super handy when you're speaking to an elected official or the media or writing a grant. And if you need county level data, we've got a great spreadsheet that has all this data that's downloadable, and we make that spreadsheet human readable. So you'll find it easy to use. We update quarterly, so add your name to our email list if you'd like to be alerted when the data is updated. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Allison. Now I would like to welcome back Sarah Beth, Maria, Sherelle, Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, Nellie, Allison, and Alicia back on stage and to show everybody's face here. Everybody is available onto the screen to answer any questions that you all might have. Here's the thing, y'all. You have been amazing and have also asked a lot of questions throughout the program, and our speakers have been able to actually answer them live. So thank you so much for that. If you have a question, I've put in the chat that you are able to ask in the chat and also the Q&A feature here. But just to get us started, y'all, as folks are preparing their questions, what are some things that you hope that they'll take away from today's conversation? Anything you hope, some top lines you're like, I want them to take away from today. Let us know what you think. And anybody can answer whenever you're ready.
Hi, I could start. I would say the main takeaway is for people to get organized and get involved. I think that is so important. That lets our elected officials know that, as one of my fellow panelists stated, that we're watching. That was something that was sometimes could be very different than what they're used to, but we're also holding them accountable and also want them to be more transparent, not only in the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, but in all of their funding and programs and services that they have to the people. And also it's very, very important that equity is implemented throughout all of the work that they do. That it should not have taken Executive Order 13985 to say that, hey, you need to make sure that your programs and services and all federal dollars are distributed equitably to Black communities, to rural communities, to persons who are differently abled, and I can go on and on. But if you have not pulled up Executive Order 13985, I would encourage you all to do so, everyone on this call, but also definitely get involved, stay organized, and make sure you hold our elected officials accountable.
I would just add the importance of coordination. There are a lot, all of us, it feels like, are starting to build out our responses to these three ongoing future policies. And the best practices are what got us here. And so I've been really grateful for the opportunities that SEAP and other folks have been compiling what are today's best practices, what are tomorrow's best practices, and encouraging coordination, not only within municipalities and counties, but also across them.
Thanks, y'all. Anybody else want to add? What are some takeaways from today's conversation?
I will just add to what all these ladies have said is for people, we truly believe that every community has its own solutions. You know what is needed in your community. And so I think a lot of times when we vote for elected officials, we kind of vote for them and expect them to just go and do it. And a lot of times it doesn't happen. And so it's important for communities to, after they vote, still show up to these meetings, hear these conversations that are happening about the funding that's coming down to your communities, and definitely connect with the organizations on the ground that are doing this work. Reach out to them, find out how you can help them. SEAP has amazing tools that communities need to use and plug into to be able to really be educated and informed about how to utilize this funding when they're coming. So a lot of times people feel like they don't know where to start. This is a great start, coming to webinars like this, finding these tools and applying them to your communities.
One thing I would add, we often think this is where I live, but we actually live in a lot of different jurisdictions. We spend our work day in this jurisdiction, this county and city. We live in this city and in this county. So the funds might be spent in your city, but there might be still funds available in your county or in the city you work in or the county you work in or the one where your kid goes to daycare. So this came to every city and every county. And so, I'd really kind of encourage people all to explore what's around you, not just immediately where your house is, because there might be still time to advocate and influence on these pots of funds that are still out there in other jurisdictions. So, no matter how small the city is, they got a pool of funds as well. So we're happy to help in any way that we can. And hope that our tracker can really show you where the funds are available all around you, not just in your city.
Thanks so much, everyone. Well, I think the best thing you can have on a webinar is have all questions answered. And it looked like all the questions have been answered. We want to thank you from SEAP just for spending your time with us, to our incredible partners on stage and those that are in the attendance pool as well. We just want to thank you for all the work that you've done the last 2 years and the special anniversary of the American Rescue Plan. We look forward to connecting with you all more and to providing you all with even more information. For those who registered for today's call, we will be doing some follow-up information, sending you some of these links that came through, and also this recording will be available on demand for you to share with your partners. Once you exit our attendee pool, you will see a survey. We encourage you to fill out the survey, mainly because that's the way to leave. So go ahead and tell us your thoughts. We would love to work with you all in the future. Today on International Women's Day, I thank all the women on the call for all the work that you do and everything that you bring to the South and what we're doing to make sure that SEAP is a great partner to you and to others. To everybody on the call, our Facebook friends, our YouTube friends, we appreciate and value you. Thank you so much for your time. For more information about SEAP and our partners, please visit our website at theseap.org. You're now able to leave the programming.